Hello, in this episode of AS for Architecture I speak with Cécile Brisac, architect and founder of Atelier Brisac, practice based in London and Paris, about her work and its motivations and her process.
AS for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of AS for Architecture. I'm talking today to Cécile Brisac, architect, urbanist, designer. Cécile, that's a short introduction. Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Good morning, Ambrose. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm an architect and I lead the practice Atelier Brisac. I thought it'd be interesting to tell you a little bit about my family background. In a way, it was kind of mixed, sort of a lot of creativity on one side, from my mother's side, really. So she had two professions. She was a child psychotherapist, but she was also a weaver, and that was sort of a side job for a long time, but then actually became her main profession eventually. Was a very creative person. She had a nickname which was Gigi with the fingers of a fairy. So anything she would make sort of came out really well. And very active person. And then also on both sides of my family, a real sense of social responsibility. My father is someone who's has a very, very strong sense of duty towards his family, but in society in general. He's an engineer by training, so much more scientific. And then I think on both sides of my family, there were a lot of discussions about politics. Politics was very much sort of, conversation around the dinner table. And I think some examples, sort of maybe more distant examples of people who had real social engagement. So, for instance, my grandmother, for instance, she was a co-founder of an NGO against torture. And then I had an uncle who, when he was 16, joined a resistance in the Second World War. And so all of those things, I think, fed into probably, both the creativity on one hand and the social consciousness, I think, fed very much who I feel I am today. So I left France to come to London when I was 18 to study at the Architectural Association School of Architecture. And I think for me, the place would enable me to so really develop personally in a way that I think the French sort of architectural education system couldn't do. Sort of much more top down, much more academic. And I think at the AA for me was, it's a place where I feel I really could thrive. It was tough. It wasn't easy. I was 18. I spoke English, but it's not the same thing as speaking English, in a conversation and actually having you to present in front of a jury at the end of your first year, in the English language. So that was a challenge. And I feel like what I got from the AA, I think I can't say that I'm the type of student who, I don't identify with any particular tutor, teacher. I don't feel like I'm the kind of, pupil of such and such teacher and any teacher in particular. I think I had several influences, but actually several experiences, sort of come to mind in the different years that, again, I think very much influenced me. So maybe to take a little bit of an anecdote, in the first year, for instance, I remember we had to design a house, very nice first year project, but then we had to build, I think it was a 1 to 10 sectional mock-up of that house. And so I was literally, in the workshop, welding steel for the steel structure, doing a glulam beam or portion of a glulam beam. I had to pour some concrete. That was a complete disaster. Got the mix completely wrong. It completely disintegrated. Mm-hmm. So the kind of experience that stays with you when you're, later on you're on site, on the construction site, and and you really understand what people are going through when they're building stuff. So that was one, and then in intermediate school, very different units, and I remember in particular studying with some tutors where the focus was very much the brief, developing a brief, and thinking about the users, and thinking about how the spaces would actually cater for the users' activities. And so that was a very different approach, which I think, again, has left a mark on me. And then in diploma school, I ended up with a unit that was much more formal in a way, or much more based on sort of, building and spatial design. We'd had to do our technical studies, and we would work hand in hand with a structural engineer to actually develop the design. I think that's maybe where I started to work, start a certain vocabulary, certain spatial vocabulary, of working in different scales and the way you use light and so on. So quite a formative experience.
It's interesting that you associate in your upbringing this combination of craft or artistry and political/social responsibility as sort of indicating a route into architecture. I mean, that's not unique, but it is particular. I was wondering was that why you chose architecture? Was it like this idea of combining these two things? Or was it just you just wanted to be an architect because it's cool?
No, I never thought about being architecture as cool. Funny enough. It's
But it
funny,
is.
it's not the word I would use, interestingly. Even though, of course, it is really super cool. But no, so I think talking about those two things is something that I've become more conscious, I think, recently, sort of thinking about my work and thinking about what is it that we do in the practice, and what is the drive behind our projects. And I think definitely, social consciousness. I mean, I'm very interested in civic buildings. I love working on public buildings. I think it's fascinating. You go back and then you see how people use them, and you kind of, you get a sense for what you're, how you're helping other people thrive as well. I really believe in that in architecture. And I think the notion of craft, because I'm really interested in making, and I think that's something that has come through as well. I think on a few buildings, a recent design of a building, mixed-use building in Paris, we kind of completely custom designed all the metalwork on the facade, from the school facade to the housing facade, etc. And I think that the whole making process was, it's fascinating. I love it. We did one-to-one mock-ups in the studio, and it's exciting. There's something really exciting about that as well. So I think that's maybe why I've thinking about what defines us, that has come up. But how did I want to become? Well, when did I know I wanted to become an architect? It was actually just, I think I can be quite specific about it. I traveled to California when I was 15. One of my older sisters was studying there at the time, and I spent a couple of months in the summer, and we had some family friends over there, and he was the designer and builder of solar powered houses. And I went with him once to a house that, was finished, actually was already lived in, but I suppose retrospectively now I could see he was probably doing snagging. And but I remember walking into that place, and the light, the volume, the light coming through from, one side of the roof, and the volume and the kind of the modernity of it. And that's something I felt like we didn't have in Europe somehow. There was something really uplifting, exciting. It's funny I use that word, because now it's a word I find that I want to use in my work, uplifting. So I think that was kind of like, a very clear moment when I was like, oh, wow, I would love to be an architect. And I was 15. But the educational system in France is such that if you're good at math, it opens up lots of avenues. And I was good at math, and I wasn't 100% sure I wanted to be an architect. I thought, well, maybe I want to go into engineering. Actually, maybe I want to be an airline pilot. I quickly realized I'd be totally bored. But anyway, so I went on to study math, and then after just one term, I sort of dropped out. I was like, no, I definitely want to do architecture. And so I sort of, we built our portfolio and then interviewed at the AA and then went there.
What did you do after the AA? Did you go back to the States?
So no, no. I mean, it was just a summer, just a couple of months in the summer. No, so after the AA, I worked in, 2, 3 years, in various offices. Again, I can't say, oh, I did 10 years at so and so, and that's who really trained me. But so I worked, I think 3, 4 years, and then very quickly we won. So this is with Edgar Gonzalez, my partner at the time. We won an open international competition for a museum in Sweden, which is the Museum of World Culture. And so so I co-founded with him, practice Brisac Gonzalez. And then we worked together for about 20 years. And then we parted ways, as it happens. And so I'm now, set up as Atelier Brisac.
You did that competition just whilst working in practice. You secured that.
Yes. Yes.
That's a very different world. Like no one would think about doing that. Is that even possible?
Well, it was definitely, we did it.
No. It was possible 20 years ago. But now, I mean, I can't even imagine anybody, just because of the way that practices have to be structured to acquire large public projects like that.
Yeah, I think there are probably, I mean, to be honest, I'm not on the lookout for these kind of projects anymore, so I'm not too sure how many of them are out there. I think there are still a few open competitions where you don't actually need to pre-qualify. But yeah, quite frankly, I haven't, since then we've just gone after sort of pre-qualification tenders. So I haven't done any more of those, but I do have, I do have people applying the office, and sometimes I see on their CV they do independent competitions. So I think they're still around.
They still exist. Could you
Still
tell me a
exist.
little? Could you tell me a little bit about Atelier Brisac? So that's been founded how many years now? And
So it's been founded, 3, 4 years ago. Yeah, about 4 years ago. So we're sort of London and Paris based, and I mean, really, it's I would say it's almost a sort of continuation of what I've been doing for the last 20 years in a way. I don't feel it's I don't feel a different person, if you see what I mean. Still interested in the same themes, topics. And in particular, well, how to describe it? It's quite funny because, I get that question quite a lot. And in fact, I remember getting that question quite early on when I got a prize as a sort of young architect in France, equivalent to 40 under 40 something. And one of the first things the journalist asks is, oh, what are you about? And I was like, oh gosh, I don't know. I it's quite difficult. I I make things, I do things. I don't necessarily think about what I do. But then, then you do think, eventually a little bit more. And I noticed that I don't actually like to be pigeonholed. Maybe that's and I think there are quite a few architects who like to define themselves, in a very, in a few words, right? In a very specific way. And I realized actually that's what I'm interested in, is actually doing a variety of projects and not repeating myself and etc. So that has made it more difficult maybe to define what I do, even though clearly there are underlying themes and underlying interests, throughout my work. So having worked on a variety of typologies, cultural, sports and leisure, educational, housing, mixed use, and so on. I think there is that one word which does come back, which is, I'm hoping anyway, that we do uplifting buildings. I've only recently set up an Instagram page, and so I had to go through, X number of years of past work. And then digging out all those photographs, I realized, yeah, there's something there that's hopefully we're doing buildings that are uplifting, that have a certain amount of clarity, that are, welcoming and based around the users. Yeah, and I think that are, hopefully designed with a sense of care.
Mm.
So, and I think care, maybe, care can, care about lots of, many different things. I mean, I think as a starting point, care about the users for sure. I think defining very much the spaces around the way people are going to experience the place and the way it's going to function for them. I think is a starting point. But then in parallel to that is obviously working at the scale of the city, right? And so we tend to design buildings both from the interior and the exterior at the same time. And it's very much a case of, trial and testing in 2D and in 3D at the same time. So in plan, obviously, as well as in 3D in the computer, but also model making. And I think with those three types, three means, you can find a solution that kind of tries to solve all the different problems, at the urban scale, at the spatial scale, and at the, functional scale. So yeah, I like to think that we work on our projects, on our buildings in several ways that are, combined. Actually, this reminds me of a really interesting conversation I had with an engineer friend of mine, about the word elegance.
Mm-hmm.
And he's an IT engineer by training, but he's working on rail infrastructure strategy. So working on, urban strategy around rail infrastructure. And he's writing a book at the moment. And he said, oh, I found this really interesting definition of elegance relating, sort of, if you think of the word elegance in the engineering field. And I'll paraphrase it, it probably won't be right, but I think the definition is something like finding a solution to a range of problems that may not be connected to begin with. So this is paraphrasing the definition. But essentially, I feel like that's what we're doing in a way. So in every project, we take on the urban quality of the project and the way the massing will actually help define the urban space, but also the way the massing will enhance the experience of the user. So to give you an example, on this mixed-use project in Paris, it's a sort of layered project of, sports center, half below ground, a school just above that, and then housing on top of that. And we were actually two architects working on that scheme. And the feasibility study was, if we had followed it, would have, led to a very long, 70-meter long, sort of, 10-story high building, which would have felt like a canyon down the street, all right? And then we found that actually the urban rules in Paris would allow us to build it a bit taller in parts of the site. And so we said, well, what if we did that? And then we found that by doing that, we could actually create two separate housing blocks, free up a lot of the roof space, and then create a sort of elevated roof garden. And then all of a sudden, you ended up with two housing buildings without any corner, anything, that just sort of blocks with completely free facades, which meant you could have very generous, continuous balconies all around. Incredible sunlight, much easier plants to deal with, much more functional, sort of, dual or even triple aspect sometimes. Very high quality of housing. Said housing buildings were basically had their feet on a, feet on a garden, on a roof garden, shared roof garden. And so working in that massing exercise together with, solving the circulation issues of how do you fit the sports center below the school, and how does the school fit below the housing, and how do you get light into the school building, which is sandwiched between the two and had a very deep floor plan but a low ceiling. It was really very much a case of working back and forth, between the overall massing and the interior spatial design.
It's a beautiful building.
Thank you.
It's got the least romantic title of any piece of architecture ever. This is Lot 04A, is that right?
That's the one.
Unbelievable name. It's like something you have a moon base or something like that. But it is, it is a really beautiful, it's a really beautiful piece of thing. And it's strange when I look at that work, and when I've looked at all the way back to the Museum of World Cultures in Gothenburg, what I think is quite interesting is that you come out of the AA and you come out of the mid-90s and early 2000s as a kind of culture of architecture, and it's kind of like brassy and inelegant. Like there's that huge amount of kind of inelegance going on at that time. Dramatic, and sort of the idea of the civic is to create these kind of pepper potting these sculptures in a way into the city, art pieces into the city. And your architecture seems to be a lot more considered than that, to have this very kind of careful engagement with the city, which is much less to do with the virtuosic one-liner and something to do with kind of this integration. You see that in this Lot 04A quite clearly, where you seem to be in a way making housing particularly, and I'm amazed that it's public social housing. Well done, France, for managing to keep to that. This idea of almost like the building itself creating a performance back to the city itself through these balconies and through this kind of roof garden and so on and so forth. How did you resist the temptation to become the sloppy one-liner of the millennial period? I mean, that takes quite a lot of guts to hold your line in that environment and succeed.
Yeah, I don't know. It was I don't know. I have to say, sort of natural, sort of like that's what
Just sheer
do.
bloody mindedness.
No, I don't know. I'm not interested in the one-liner bit. It's the same thing as like trying to define the office as sort of, what do we do? Oh, that's what we do. Boom. It's sort of like, actually, I think, yeah, that's the beauty about architecture is, it is about taking all of those ingredients, the urban, the user, the materiality, the sustainability, all of those really, really kind of varied, issues, sometimes completely contradictory. I mean, the notion of sustainability is like, for me, it's a real existential question for architects, actually. Yeah, and then I just enjoy working with all of these and actually finding the right recipe that make them all work in that particular site, which maybe that's the difference also, is that, well, the difference, I don't know, but, I'm very interested in creating places that belong to where they are, right? So yeah, sure, I studied in the era of globalization, and before that you had the modernist movement earlier on in the 20th century. I mean, you've had these moments in architectural history where architecture wasn't necessarily place-based, right? But I'm really interested in architecture that is place-based. Actually, this is a funny comment we heard once in Gothenburg from our Swedish client. Obviously neither of us is Swedish, and we were told, "Oh my God, you've designed the most Swedish building, that we could think of. You really understood Swedish culture." And we went from there. We hadn't lived there, but we picked up on something, and certainly, it has become a real hangout place in Gothenburg. People hang out on the stairs. The main atrium has become an event space. It's very successful that way. So yeah, I'm really interested in, I think, making places that have a sense of purpose. I mean, they are where they are for a reason, and so they should function where they are, right?
Mm. It's difficult though in cities, isn't it? Because cities are such amorphous places, such hybrid places. I mean, take yourself, you're Parisian, French, British hybrid, living here, living there. I mean, what does it mean to be place-based? We're not talking about the earth here. We're talking about a kind of deeper cultural idea, which I find difficult to work out what that could possibly mean. How do you reconcile this? Like, how do you go about discerning what place is?
So, well, I think I couldn't give a general definition
Oh,
or
go
a
on.
general answer because that's the whole point. It's very specific.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, even two sites in Paris, I wouldn't deal with them in the same way,
Hmm.
or two sites in London. I mean, that's exactly what the sense of place is, right? So
Hmm.
a dense, there in Batignolles, we were on the edge of a park. All right. So landscape was very much part of the design. On another site in Paris, we did a sports center, which was on in a former rail yard and on the edge of or next to railway tracks. Completely different urban environment, and we did a very different architecture and dealt with the ground plane in a very different way. That one, the Pajol Sports Centre, was a building which is completely transparent at ground floor level. You can, walk in on one side, which is the plaza side, and then through the building, and then keep going all on one plane, and then face the railway tracks, facing east with an amazing morning light. That is all on one plane.
Mm.
Batignolles, it's much more convoluted. It's much more complex. You've got sort of 5 building entrances all on the ground floor, and to get into the sports center, you go down a stair and you kind of overlook the space, the sort of double height space from above because it's so dense and so intertwined. But that was also due to the nature of the place and the brief and the place.
Mhm.
So yeah, I can't really give a general answer to that. But maybe to pick up on your notion of the land, or the earth, rather, it's an interesting observation I sort of have made, recently, that there has been an evolution with the way we deal with the earth or the land. I think, for me, at least in my stretch of career so far, um, at the beginning, sort of landscape design was an add-on, all right? And so you design a building and then the landscape came afterwards.
Mhm.
And actually really feel for landscape architects or landscape designers who, quite often I think would get the short end of the stick. Nowadays, and I've noticed that in our own way of thinking, we'd start with, okay, this is where we are, that's the land, that's the earth. And, how little can we take from this to do our building
Yeah.
amongst, in the middle of this land, in the middle of this earth. And so, for instance, the one of the recent buildings I completed outside of Paris in Ville-Genisse, which is mostly housing. It also has some retail and a nursery. And it's it's quite a large building. It's about 130 something housing units, but quite low. And the site is an entire block. And the whole design, the whole premise was what is the smallest footprint we can take. We're on a green field, well, former exterior sports field, so essentially green field, and yeah, the premise was how little can we take from this, and how much can we give back? So, we have all these terraces. Unfortunately, of course, they're not, green as much as the land is. But that was the idea. We just have just a building that's a ring just cut into the ground, but the rest is completely untouched and massive garden in the middle with trees and so on. So I think there's, the way we're thinking also about building is completely different. Yeah.
I want to come to this word you used, elegance, which sounds so much nicer when you say it, but it is a lovely word, and I think it's something that I've kept in mind for many years, since my PhD supervisor, Diana Mitlin, when I was writing in the initial stages of my PhD, and I was writing the critique of what I wanted to kind of explore and examine. And I was being a bit fiery, and that means horrible. And she said to me, always be elegant. In your criticisms, always be elegant. And I thought, this is a quintessential English idea. I don't know if it's just English, but it felt like, what a hilarious way of putting it. But it's a really good piece of advice. Always be elegant. And I like this idea that these twin things that you've picked up on, uplifting and elegance. Now I want to come to uplifting in a bit, but what do you mean by elegance? I understand it in engineering terms. I know you've given a definition. I understand it in engineering terms. There's something elegant about a well-engineered system. And I also want to come to this idea of engineering, which I think goes back to your upbringing, which is that your buildings are at scale. They're always big, and there's always these big volumes in them. And so engineering is very visually very present in your work. And you seem to design the structures, again, in that engineering sense of elegant. They're sufficient. They're not overblown. They're there. You can see them. You can engage with them. But what does it mean in terms of your spatial organization and plan? What would be an elegant, maybe in your using examples of your own work, how would you define this elegance? How would you describe it?
It's interesting because I actually using the word.
Sorry, I guess what I'm trying to get to is like, where does it differentiate from good manners? Because that's a disease. Like, elegance is better than good manners, but I think that some people would say it means being polite, and being polite means not scaring the horses.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, I hope that the buildings are neither rude nor overly provocative, but also not too good mannered to be boring.
Yeah.
I think I'm not interested in being too boring. So there has to be a little bit of excitement, I think. But I don't know. I think it's funny because I think if I think of the word elegance in a in the way that we might use it on, whatever, some item of clothing or, something like that, then it becomes very subjective. And so I have to say, I think, I've heard a couple of people use that word, for the buildings that we do. Oh, this is very elegant. But, I think it's very subjective. And I would find it very pompous to say, oh, we design really elegant buildings, That's what we do, very elegant architecture. So I don't know if I could give a definition of what makes them elegant or not. But maybe I could describe some of the design moves that I use that I think come back. And I think the most important one is the use of light. And scale. So maybe to be a little bit more specific, light in that I'm always trying to bring natural light all the way into a space, even where it would not normally find its way. So for instance, on that school in that school, the part of the building that was a school in Batignolles, there's a very deep floor plan, very low ceiling. And so we introduced all these light wells in that roof terrace that would light all the circulation spaces. But then those circulation spaces are also designed very generously, so they're more spacious. So I think maybe generosity of space is another one I think that come to mind, which then means that those spaces, they're not just corridors, you're actually gathering spaces as well, and they can become lively places for the children to use, and of an extension of the classroom or the assembly hall. Similarly in the sports center, which was half below ground, very tricky to get any light into it. So, but we do have clear story lighting, and then interior glazing, which means then you have visual links between the different spaces. So even though you're below ground in a 70-meter deep building, you know exactly where you are in relation to the outside, and you know where you are from one room to another. You know where you are, so all the circulation spaces are glazed. There's even sometimes windows between different sports halls, which that brings technical challenges because you need fire separation, acoustic separation, etc. And I think these are maybe moves that come back. Another one I think is a sense of scale, and I think so you say interestingly, a lot of the buildings have big volumes and clearly engineering moves in them. But actually, I'm not interested in anything that's imposing. And I think that was one of the characteristics in the museum in Gothenburg is the entrance hall is actually just a 3-meter high ceiling space. So it's very cozy, very, very welcoming. You don't feel intimidated. And then eventually you do discover this sort of tall atrium, and that's much more grand. But I'm much more interested in buildings that make people feel welcome. In the sports center in Pajol in Paris, that was in quite a rough neighborhood. Methadone clinics down the road and everything. That building was actually a pilot scheme to help develop or help set up a new benchmark for sustainability. And so we worked a lot on, natural light and natural ventilation and so on, but also acoustics. And so you're in that, wood sports hall, and it's very calm. It's a bit of a haven for the youth that live in the neighborhood. So yeah, I think it's a combination of things.
It's almost like an elegant equation. I know nothing about mathematics, like literally nothing, but I can count my fingers, but I know of the idea of an elegant equation. I don't know what it means, but as far as I can tell, it's something, and this goes back to this idea that you articulated earlier about the careful balancing of competing interests towards a comprehensive, meaningful whole, I was just writing down some of the words that you were using. You talked about program, you talked about the social, you talked about the aesthetics, you talked about materials, you talked about the urban, you talked about scale, obviously light. And I think that's a really interesting idea, that like the good architect becomes almost like this magical mathematician who can somehow position these things in an elegant equation to get the right result. I think that's possibly what you're doing, but with less pretentious language than certainly I'm using. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I did want to know about the operation of your practice as a kind of SME, as it's called, small to medium enterprise. I think that's what that stands for.
Mm-hmm.
How have you found working in practice? And how does running a practice at the moment, what does it look like for you? What do you see to be the future of architecture? Because something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently is the way that practices seem to be either becoming supersized and delivering supersized projects, or there's small practices, and the medium-sized practices seem to be struggling. How do you maintain, as an SME, how do you maintain an identity as an architect in relation to the kind of context of architectural production in the contemporary period?
Interestingly, I think there's always been a little bit of a I don't know about disconnect is not necessarily the right word, but a funny mix between the kind of size of practice that we are and the kind of work that we do. So fairly small practice doing, not minute projects. And so I think that's been, that hasn't necessarily helped having smooth sailing. But I think what's my experience has been that whatever the ups and downs, whatever the circumstances, ways of practice, ways of practicing, I find that I always go back. There's certain things I always go back to, and I think these are, interestingly, these are the things that I learned to develop as, sort of graduate architect or as a student architect. And these are the things I kind of always go back to, that kind of, they always, the underlying thread sort of drive my work. And that's what I always go back to. And I think that helps. It helps the focus on, what do I want the practice to be working on? What do I want what do I want the practice to focus on?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I could ever have had a very, very large practice, but I'm sure if I had more of a commercial mindset, I probably would have, but that was not my ambition. Um, Again, I don't know that I could necessarily generalize about, which is the way architects would be or should be practicing now. But one thing I'm certain of is that as architects, we bring an added value, and an intelligence, and and a humanity that cannot really be replaced. Obviously there's AI coming, and for me that's okay. That's great. But it's probably just another tool, and it might mean the tool that leads to certain, I don't know, maybe sort of repetitive projects and
Mm-hmm.
cookie cutter projects. But it's not like those have never existed throughout history. You look at the Victorian terraced house, or the Haussmannian buildings, or the sort of prefabricated buildings in the 50s. Cookie cutter architectures has existed even without AI,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe AI will make us do things faster in the same way that when CAD came, or 3D renderings came, it helped us produce things faster. But is it actually going to take away from our creativity and intelligence and what we can bring as architects? No, I don't. I don't think so. Um, I think I think there are other questions. There are definitely questions. I've been asking myself as an architect, like, how much should we be building? I mean, we've been trained to build, to
Mm-hmm.
design, to build, right? Created more new buildings than renovations, but now doing more renovations. And it's certainly, I think, a real question about what the role of the architect is, and how careful should one be, in terms of the way we practice our profession. And I think, I would question sort of volume building, volume design, without being careful. I would definitely question that.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, as to your answer in terms of the size of practice and so on. Again, I can really only speak for myself. It's a bit hard to generalize, but sometimes I do wonder, what's the purpose of them? Um, you know, Other than being large businesses, and I'm sure quite profitable. But yeah, I'm more interested in sort of purposeful.
I mean, that's clear. And I think I guess I've heard quite a lot from architects of practices of approximately your size, or in the field that you work in, a kind of mounting despair about the future of practice and the future of architectural practice. And I find it slightly difficult, because as a discussion point, because I don't actually think that those giant practices are producing anything that's what would historically be understood as architecture anymore. I mean that for most of the big buildings in the City of London. Those tower blocks, they're feats of engineering and systems management and urban planning, which I genuinely believe within a decade will be replaced by AI. I don't think there's any need for an architect to be involved in that process at all. I honestly, I mean, I just can't see the point of what the architect's doing. It's like Robert Venturi's only interested in the last 5 millimeters. Well, they're not even interested in that. So I don't, so the question, and as an educator, is like, what are we trying to teach the students to do? Like, what is the knowledge that we have as architects, so you have as an architect, that is unique to your method and is of a significant value? And I think in some of the projects you've talked about, I think it's very clear. And it comes back to this idea of uplifting, but it also comes back to this idea of place and like identifying that, which is, it's kind of mysterious. Am I right in thinking it's a kind of mysterious process at its heart, the process of design?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, I guess any sort of, I don't know, actually. Mysterious. I don't know, but I certainly think that, well, you don't know what's going to come out before you start, that's for sure. Is that what you mean by mysterious?
Pretty mysterious.
So that is mysterious, I guess, right? It's like, yeah, I'm not too sure what's going to come out when I start. Maybe that's what creativity is about. If you actually know beforehand what the result is going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. But maybe that's not being very creative, I suppose. I'm not saying it's not like we reinvent the wheels every time, either. But yeah, I think you kind of have to trust yourself also that the process is going to lead you in a certain, in a way. But at the same time, the architect is very much, I was trying to think of an analogy. I think it's we're both the composer and the conductor. So we're the composer because, we actually compose the music, right? We compose the space, right? But we're also the conductor because we are the ones, this is an interesting conversation I've had with, several clients now. We are the ones at the beginning of a project. We are there at the beginning of the project and we are there at the end of a project. And especially when you work with let's say an institutional client, it may not be the same person on the client side at the start of the project and at the end of the project. So we, the architects, are the kind of continuous thread throughout. We carry the history of the project and we have to direct everyone, right? So obviously we work for the client, so we take instructions from the client, but then we conduct the team of engineers. We, conduct we're not the builders, but we give them direction, etc. So we have this dual role. We composers and directors, conductors, sorry, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting, and I think that's which is why I'm not sure it can be replaced so easily. I think the biggest threat I find to the profession is actually, it would be sort of procurement methods. It would be politics. I actually think, you were making a comment about, well done France for still building social housing like that. That would not happen without, policy, without politics behind, so in a way, as architects, unless you're involved in politics and in policy making, it's you're dependent on that, right? And then obviously that's for public sector, right? But even procurement methods, etc., in the public sector, it's changing a lot in France, for instance. A lot less competition than there used to be, and that has a massive impact on, I think, on the role of architects and the possibility that architects have, to have access to designing interesting buildings.
It's very interesting hearing about your work. It's very good. I mean, it's really, really beautiful to see. And I'm amazed that you work at such enormous scale. I find it so sort of, it's really easy as an academic where you kind of have these ideas and you're critical about stuff and That's your job. And then you meet an architect and they're building these massive, fucking huge buildings. And it's so complicated. And it's unbelievable that one person takes it on. It's ridiculous.
So it's never one person, it's not just one person, it's a team of people. But yeah, I think we are both the composer and the conductor, it's sort of, yeah, it's sort of like, yeah. And I think eventually, it sort of dawned on me that notion. And and in a way you have to take it on. Well, you take it on or don't do it, because but if you're going to do it, you actually have to take it on. And then actually people love it. In Batignolles, we did, before we started on site and the contractor was appointed, we did a 1-day workshop with them. Actually, I think it was even 2 days. Just to go through the 4 different parts of the building and to explain to them the architecture, the technique behind it, the intent, And so they had their teams of site managers and so on. And we had the whole design team and the client team. And we had, we did presentations, and then we had the models, and it was brilliant because they knew what they were working towards, and it was like, it's much more of a team effort. And okay, it was really tough. At least we had them on a bit more on our side from that, but.
Well, it's a great point to finish on. Thank you very much, Cécile. I've enjoyed a great deal speaking to you.
Same here, very much. Thank you very much, Ambrose.
The rest is silence, as someone once said. Thanks to Cécile for taking the time to speak with me. Please see the podcast description for links to Atelier Brisac and to Cécile's professional profile. And thanks for listening.